Breaking news. The U.S. ambassador to NATO discusses Putin, membership fees, and grain trades. Russia has stopped complying with an international agreement that allowed grain to be exported from Ukrainian Black Sea ports it has been blocking. It has caused widespread concern about the future of food supplies. According to the Kremlin, the agreement brokered by Turkey last year was no longer acceptable. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has criticized Russia's move, labeling it blackmail and stating, "No one has the right to destroy the food security of any nation." Russia launched an early morning attack on the port of Odessa, and Ukrainian forces responded by shooting down dozens of exploding drones and 6 cruise missiles. Biden's latest criticism came after he declared a few days earlier that Putin, the Russian president, had already lost the war. U.S. Ambassador to NATO Julianne Smith joins us for an interview. Historian, military strategist, and government advisor Edward Luttwak claims that U.S. Vice President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin are prepared to reach an agreement. As part of an interview with Unheard's Freddie Sayers this week, Luttwak made the claim that a shift in the overall situation has made the two leaders more amenable to negotiating an end to the Ukraine war. The author, who has spent decades working both inside and outside of the Pentagon and the U.S. Department of State, is confident that communication lines between the CIA and the Kremlin are open enough for peace talks to progress. To reassure Sergei Naryshkin, the head of Russia's SVR Foreign Intelligence Service, after the failed Wagner Group uprising at the end of last month, CIA Director William Burns spoke with him directly. Luttwak concludes this shows a certain overall attitude and willingness to communicate, and he adds that Naryshkin's presence in the Kremlin itself is further evidence that the war may be winding down. Naryshkin is the one who warned Putin directly, "Don't do it. You have a problem with Ukraine," just before the war broke out. "You should rather communicate than argue. Avoid starting a war," as Luttwak argued. Someone in the Kremlin has assumed this role and has thus far avoided dismissal. He's still in charge at SVR and he hasn't left. Meanwhile, the director of U.S. intelligence is calling him. Why is that, exactly? U.S. policy is to bring an end to the conflict. As further proof that Biden is preparing for later, war-ending negotiations, the strategist cited Biden's refusal to accept Ukraine into NATO. "You can use this as leverage in negotiations with the Russians. The only way to end this war," he said, "is through negotiations." Putin's recent comments on the likelihood of a Russian nuclear attack arguably reveal his own willingness to de-escalate, indicating that this eagerness to strike a deal extends beyond the American camp. "The priority is to end the war," Luttwak says. When asked about the use of nuclear weapons, Putin said, "I will not use them at all, unless Russia faces imminent destruction. That is to say, we will strike back. We are not going to have a first strike," which is the exact same position as that of Israel, India, Pakistan, and the United States. According to Luttwak, Putin's sudden desire to end the conflict stems from his fears for Russia's inflation rate as a result of the war. He argued that Putin's motives had nothing to do with tactical operational military tanks. To keep inflation under control, his director of the Russian Central Bank is now signaling that the war has to not build up, but scale down. And because people in Russia's towns are so widely dispersed, inflation is a catastrophe. They'd have to commute 200 miles to get to a different city where they could find work. What a deal between Russia and Ukraine would look like was laid out in detail by Luttwak. He argued that plebiscites in Donetsk and Luhansk were the only way to end the conflict, and that the Russians should withdraw from the rest of Ukraine. "The plan of holding plebiscites may be the most ridiculous plan, but there's no other plan," he remarked. "Russians must abandon any pretense of sovereignty over the rest of Ukraine and instead focus on the 2 regions currently under their control. Second, Crimea must be ceded by the Ukrainians. Crimea was never Ukrainian. Khrushchev merely made an administrative transfer. Then he said, once Ukraine gives up Crimea and accepts these terms, Ukraine can enter NATO. The payoff is there. This is why you don't hand it over to them gratis." Seeing urgency on both sides, Lutwak saw no reason why negotiations couldn't start right away. There are two possibilities. The first is that everything will go exactly as I predicted. On the other hand, it might not. If it doesn't, we might as well prepare for the 7 Years' War. It's possible the conflict will last for 25 years.